Hello and welcome to episode 18 of A is for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today with Professor Ola Uduku, head of the School of Architecture at the University of Liverpool. We talk about two of her books, Learning Spaces in Africa, published by Routledge in 2018, and Africa Beyond the Post-Colonial, a volume Ola edited with Alfred Zach Williams, published by Routledge in 2017.
There had been some forms of larger settlements, even in the kinship networks, because there was already trades taking place. But what happens with, if you like, this encounter with colonialism and modernity is that these centers either become absorbed and therefore have a kind of more European element that becomes part of what already had been a collection of people, or the collection of people who were downstream from wherever the new center is become, well, I would say it's almost an accretion. So they become part of this planned city. But that accretion is something that I think is an encounter with modernity, which is unique. So the idea about it just being slums and so on, I think is shorthand for something much more creative.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again. I'm talking today with Ola Uduku. Ola, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Ola Uduku, and I'm now head of school at the University of Liverpool's School of Architecture. I'm a professor in architecture, and I guess my specialism is modernism in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly West Africa, but I'm also interested in diasporas and communities, particularly in urban areas in the global north and the global south.
That's a beautifully precise and concise description of what you do. I think your expertise is hugely important to us, certainly to my students at the moment. I'm sort of have a lot of students who are interested in the African diaspora, and issues around identity are increasingly important, I think, in architecture. My first encounter with you, I think, was, my gut feeling is that I met you as an undergraduate when I was an undergraduate at Manchester, but I'm not sure if that's true.
That might have been via Liverpool, because I did have an early stint in Liverpool. It was my first actual lecturing job after graduating from Cambridge. So it's possible that that's where you may well have met me.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I migrated north.
Yeah, up to Edinburgh. My interest, I suppose, to foreground it, my interest in the issues around modernism in Africa came via a book by a woman called Jennifer Robinson, who wrote an excellent short book called Ordinary Cities, about the experience of modernity in Africa by people who, sort of within the discourse around modernism, particularly in urban studies and architecture, aren't seen as being modernized. And I thought it's a beautifully written book. And then I've read two of your books, which we're going to touch on today: Learning Spaces in Africa, Critical Histories of the 21st Century, of 21st Century Challenges and Change by Routledge, and Africa Beyond the Post-Colonial, Political and Social Cultural Identities, which you edited with Alfred Zach Williams, who's in the States, is he?
No, he's actually in Liverpool, amazingly. He's an emeritus professor of sociology now. He's actually off Sierra Leonean extraction, but has done a lot of work in West Africa, mainly Sierra Leone and Nigeria. But he's a professor of sociology.
I see.
Or he was a professor of sociology.
Well, they're both beautifully written books, and they're really, really interesting. And I was, really pleased to be able to have a pick through them. And I picked out some themes that I thought we could talk about. And I asked my wife and I asked my children, if you were asking someone about modern architecture in West Africa, what would you want to know? And my daughter said, the first question, and it, out of the mouths of babes, what was traditional domestic life or home life like? Because this is kind of what we frame all this discussion in relation to, isn't it?
To a large extent, yes. I think that is a perspicacious question from your daughter. which probably makes sense because normally people think about Africa and they go straight to the idea about the safari or whatever architecture is in relation to that. But no, I think the issue is, I guess from an intellectual perspective, the issue would be more around, nowadays anyway, I often start with the literature. There's a lot of literature on Africa. And we've had a number of Nobel Prize winners now, but the work of the late, great Chinua Achebe and how he talks about Africa, the African village, and how people lived in a kind of traditional cultural sense, and how modernity hits the traditional, the everyday in Africa. So his main book, which I guess is kind of the foundational discussion about, I would say, community and African, and in other words, how Africans live from an African perspective, would be his book, Things Fall Apart, where, I mean, it is from the Yeats saying, things fall apart, turning and turning in the winding gar, things fall apart, and nothing's ever the same again. But he basically talks about a small village and their encounter with the white man, both as a missionary, first of all, and then the whole colonial encounter. So the view of the village is from both the eyes of the people in the village, but then from the eyes of the colonial officers and also the missionaries coming in. So that encounter with what had been over time and a new being, which I guess one could call colonialism, which then becomes modernity. So that's the way I would always frame it. But our understanding about what is modern in Africa is, I guess, much more nebulous from the perspective. But I guess in terms of everyday living, though, I think there is very much kind of, it does come from anthropology, which I know we're going to go into. But the idea about the community in Africa being somewhat more, well, the word is autarkic, I think it is, more like self-governing small groups of people in villages versus the big cities, until you get to the parts of what was Islamic architecture. So from about the 17th century onwards, from the fringes of the Sahara to the north of the Sahara, you have very strong Islamic influence. So, large, walled cities or town cities like Kano, Sokoto, a number of cities that are part of what was the furthest reaches of the Hausa Islamic empire. So that is very different from the coastal communities who were much more autonomous. They did their thing. They had their own organizing settlements, which again, obviously the heinous effects of the slave trade begin to have an effect on. But part of the reasons that have been said that historically the slave trade was so successful is because a lot of these small communities could not organize themselves against, basically the incoming Portuguese, Dutch, British, whoever. So there's that idea about, I guess, almost a romantic vision, slightly rose-tinted glasses about these small coastal and forest communities of small groups of people who had their own living systems, their own governance systems. So if we then go more granularly to the architecture itself, then we can talk about what the buildings were in these villages. So we're into the vernacular and traditional architecture, which of course has this encounter with the modern or the colonial when the colony comes in to take over what had been a much more, whatever the African pre-colonial settlement was.
And was the pre-colonial settlement based around tribal or ethnic, or these are difficult words because these words are understood within our own discourse, within a Western, shall we say, white framing of those words. So when I say tribal, I appreciate that what I understand as tribe might not be relevant here, but or was it based around family groupings? Is it more like particularly in the West African context? Is it more like that?
I think so. I mean, the closer, again, you borrowing directly from sociology, anthropology, kinship networks. So, and that's actually not that different, to be honest, from Europe, probably post-medieval Europe. Yeah. So, there would be somebody who would not be a chief. The word chief, actually, particularly in southern Nigeria, for example, so I'm dual nationality, I'm also Nigerian and British. The idea about the chief actually came in with the colonials who wanted, people to talk to, who would sub-govern. But in most places, you would have the elders and you'd have families. And again, because there were these disparate groups and communities, the idea would be that you enhance your family by effectively, marrying well, but marrying into kinships near and around you. You rarely ever went more than probably 40 miles away from your village to get married. So you are sort of increasing these kinship networks through marriage, trade, and some other things as well. But more, I would say, kinship than necessarily tribe, although it is true that linguistically, although Africa has, I think, well, someone like Nigeria has apparently more than 500 registered languages, but there are some large language groups who, again, more from the missions, to be honest, when they started transcribing the Bible, they have what they call the Igbo National Union Bible, which is all the kind of ethnic, or I guess it would be the same as dialects of Igbo, are kind of smoothened into this dialect that is now used to transcribe the Igbo Bible, which people, the missionaries in the 1860s or maybe even earlier, were involved in putting together. So, but to show you how different it is, if you think about East Africa, Swahili starts from really the southern reaches of Botswana, or northern reaches of Botswana, right up to Tanzania, Somalia. Whereas in the case of the Igbo Bible, you're talking of a very, very small area, probably not more than 200 meters diameter, right through, to just show you how many languages there are and the need to actually, if you like, in terms of, again, modernizing the ways in which one communicates, these languages become smoothened out into Union Igbo. That's what it was called. Yeah.
It's amazing. That's amazingly interesting. I want to come back to this idea of modernization, this thing you pick out about medieval Europe. So you've got this idea of modernization. Hannah Arendt talks about this. Marx talks about this. Everybody who's theorized about the emergence of modernity has theorized about the character of pre-Reformation, essentially, pre-Reformation Europe, which is based around, I suppose, non-economically productive or less economically productive forms of kinship networks, as you call it. And in Marx's analysis of the emergence of capitalism, you get this idea that modernity or modernization acts like a steamroller, squishes people into urban centers, breaks down a kind of what he calls a feudal system, but it's a kind of networked and is that essentially the same process that is then applied to the African context, or is there something distinctly? Is there some distinct character to the kind of colonial imperial onslaught on Africa?
Well, I think you could read it into it. And the fact that effectively, again, you have warring groups of Europeans who are wanting a piece of the action as well.
Yeah.
So it's not just, so if we take the United Kingdom, you could say that, the beginning of the industrial complex, the industrialization and the, iron mills and so on, that modernity comes and we now start looking at a less feudal system of peasant-led farming. I think in the case of Africa, unfortunately, one does have to mention the effects of the slave trade. Although, the historians say it should be noted that there was already trade and trade networks before the slave trade. So these ideas about trading activities and how the encounter with the other was something that was already there, but was, if you like, accommodated and moderated over time, is something that did affect Africa. Did it change their production values? Probably not as much as, obviously, the effects of an event like the slave trade and indeed the coming of the missions. So let's take North Africa, for example. So with, as I said, the Islamic Empire comes large trade routes to places like Timbuktu. And so on. And they are trading with people from the northern parts of West Africa. So that idea about trade is not, predates the slave trade. You also have evidence now of indeed the Chinese, for example, on the east coast of Africa, the Swahili coast. So they've had direct contact with Oman, parts of India, and parts of China. There's shards of apparently Chinese pottery that have now been found around Mombasa and so on. So this history, in fact, I did write a paper a while ago where I said that in some ways Africa was modern before the word modern was actually understood, in the sense that these encounters with others had happened for a lot of time, really probably from about the Reformation. Because you also have, I mean, although they're still, I hear they're now being slightly disputed, people like Marco Polo and so on, they're going to China, but they're also going south, you know, towards, well, what was then, I guess, the Maghreb, and the outer reaches of the Maghreb again go across to Africa. So the idea of the other is not unknown. And the idea that one trades, you know, with both one's kinship networks and further afield is also part of the oral history of a lot of African kinship groups or tribes, if you want to call them it there. But what then pushes them to a much more, I guess, modernized state where people have to, you know, are producing to a modernist technique or whatever, comes in much later. So yes, that, if you like, modernism in the eyes of the European in Africa probably does begin with the colonial and missionary encounter, and indeed the slavery encounter.
So this idea of the other, I think is something worth picking up. And I think it comes to my second point in a way, which is this idea of the emergence, as you call it in your book, the emergence of anthropology with its focus on primitive, inverted commas, other culture. And so this idea which we get with colonization, and I think you point to this in a number of the things that you've written and in the book with Zach Williams, is this idea that modernity is predicated on an idea of othering and making primitive that which it is not. So it does it to the pre-Reformation period in Britain, and you can see this. So for a historian of my background, you can see this in the way that, for example, discussions around pre-Reformation civic, social, religious life are framed as barbaric. We even call it the Dark Ages, as if that's an acceptable thing to call anything. And you look at you look at some of the cultural and material outputs of the Dark Ages, and they're extraordinarily brilliant. You look at Saxon jewelry; it's, you know, craftsmanship of a standard that we could only dream of, really. Anyway, and you look at the cathedrals and so on and so forth. So there's this othering that goes on, and then this seems to be something that we in architecture, in the modern period, actually embrace and use it as a way of kind of, I don't know what it's for. Le Corbusier is the preeminent example with his vernacularisms, but it goes before that, doesn't it, to Gottfried Semper, and it goes
exactly. Yeah. And you've got people like Brancusi. There are lots of people who, for lack of a better word, appropriate the exotic. So you're into the kind of Orientalism almost. There are these other cultures that are really exotic, exoticized, and can only contribute in a different way to what is, well, the Western canon would be the way I would say so. But I think obviously, again, this is where the ominous effect of slavery, I mean, a lot of the writing around there suggests that there was the need to other because you have to actually justify why people become chattel. You see what I mean? So it becomes even more important to separate. And particularly with the missionaries, indeed, I guess the similarity would be somewhere like Ireland. It was very important to say you need to come to religion in order to take away the primitive nature of the past. And that in itself, I mean, even my late father, I mean, he went to one of the best schools of the time, which is actually a government college. So it was run by the colonials, not the missionaries. But he would always say, African culture is seen as primitive. So, it was very much, so we're talking right up to whatever, early part of the 20th century, probably right up until the 60s. The idea that, whatever was before the missions was really primitive, and you really need to get rid of that to come into the modern world, right up to your buildings, your dress, your everything.
So this idea of the colonial experience in Africa, and this idea of this pre-existing urban and architectural form based around kinship networks, I kind of am interested to think about what that might look like spatially, formally, aesthetically. And then, and are we to understand this process of urbanization that's occurred in Africa at an incredible speed in places like Lagos and southern West Africa? Is that a process of modernization? Is the kind of the new urban center a process of modernization? And do we see in those spaces a new form of modernity as a consequence that is inherently African, a kind of African inflection of modernism?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is modernization the word to use? It is in a way, because to a large extent, although having said so, I mean, I'm thinking as I'm talking now, I mean, I would say indeed cities like Lagos, actually before Lagos was Badagry, which is a major slaving
it was called
point.
Badagry.
Yeah, in fact, Lagos is the equivalent to, I don't know, what would be the example? It would be like talking about Greenwich in relation to somewhere much further north in London. So Lagos, the history of Lagos is such that the major king of that area was a major slave trader. So the British decided to depose him. And what easier way than to create another kind of administrative capital down the road and put your brother in charge? So Badagry was actually the main space, or I guess, what would I call it, urban enclave or populated enclave on that part of coastal Africa. And you have it happening all the time. So for example, in Accra, in Ghana, the main capital was in Elmina, which is further down. So oftentimes they would take away from where the original, or where most of the original trading went on, to create another smaller town or city that has the administrative focus, and whom those who are involved in governing are seated, and therefore the new town, so to speak, can be planned. But what's happened over time generally with these other cities is that they become part of a bigger metropolis. So in the case of Accra and Elmina, you got Tema. It's becoming this very, I would say, a much longer, well, a linear situation where you've got the original center and the new center. The only, I guess it's only in places like Mombasa versus Nairobi you see a great difference. So Mombasa is coastal, Nairobi is upcountry somewhere. And again, that's a purely European construction. I think it was not even a village. It was literally new land that then becomes this major city, administrative capital. But my point being that there had been some forms of larger settlements, even in the kinship networks, because there was already trades taking place. But what happens with, if you like, this encounter with colonialism and modernity is that these centers either become absorbed and therefore have a kind of more European element that becomes part of what already had been a collection of people, or the collection of people who were downstream from wherever the new center is become, well, I would say it's almost an accretion. So they become part of this planned city. But that accretion is something that I think is an encounter with modernity, which is unique. So the idea about it just being slums and so on, I think is shorthand for something much more creative. But it's called that because it doesn't fit into the pattern of obviously the colonial plan. So we're back to maybe the Roman plans in the UK. Just that, if you like, the Roman era passes and then we have some archaeology, then we have the next. In this case, as you're right, I think your point is well made. Because of the rapidity of the growth, they kind of merge together. There's never this kind of point where it all stops and then we start again. It just gets added to. I'd say it's much more accretion over time. And then what we have is what's called chaotic modernism or whatever. Whereas I would say that there's something before the modernity oftentimes, and there's something that then becomes created, which doesn't fit in with the way in which indeed the Western framing, or indeed let's be even more, United Nations viewing sometimes of what good urban settlement is. So, I mean, in the past, I've done a course on African cities, and I pointed out that, I think it's supposed to be 2.1. A bedroom shouldn't have more than 2 people. Fine, that's okay in Europe. But in a lot of Africa, for most of the time, we're outside. Anyway, so if you've got 4 kids in a bedroom, that's not overcrowding, because for a lot of the time they're not there. Yeah. If it's northern Nigeria, for example, which I know, which has a much more Sahel, dry, arid climate, you're actually sleeping on the roof. So the fact that a house might have 2 rooms and therefore it might be considered a slum, and thinking about it in whatever UN or whatever terms, is very much framed around what the European situation would be, as opposed to how people live their lives.
Yes.
So even when we transpose that to new buildings and so on, it still looks as though this is really chaotic and so on. But there's a method in the madness.
Yes, that really interesting. Coming back to this idea of the kinship network, my guess. So this is just a purely speculative guess. I did my doctoral research in rural Gujarat, and what I saw they were semi-nomadic communities there. And the families, and I stayed with one in an informal settlement, and it was me. I got the bed because I was the guest, and my friend Prash, he was on the floor, and then the family was all around. We were all in one room, and it was actually very well. It made me feel less vulnerable. I can tell you that for free. But what seemed to happen in these genuinely indigenous, the vernacular communities of very ancient standing, is that as the sons and daughters married, community compounds, so family compounds built within the settlement, would expand. And so perhaps what we see in the kind of what we see as chaotic emergence of cities like Lagos is really a kind of organic process of community growth, which is not replicable, as you say, by top-down diktats from the UN or whoever it is.
Well, that's right. I mean, in some ways it works well when they do work with anthropologists, to be honest. So there's a part of Ghana, Accra, Jamestown, which from the name you can imagine had an early encounter with, well, there's a fort. What's the fort? There's a fort near there. I think it is the British fort. And, there have been settlements that have been built up over time. But they actually do have a sanitation network there, which was put in by, I think it's British engineers at the end of early 20th century. And I know my colleague, actually, Ian Jackson, he went down with a group who had water sanitation engineers, and they actually tested the water that came through pipes. So it's a very historic Victorian pipe system in place. Yeah. And the water was actually incredibly clear. The quality was very good because they kept those drainage networks and things and worked with local communities. So actually you'd have better drainage in what would be considered a fairly chaotic semi-slum settlement than in some of these posher neighborhoods where everybody's got a borehole and nobody's sampling the water. Yeah. So if it's done properly and in relationship to what the indigenous community networks are, you sometimes have some really interesting what would I call it, solutions to things where you think it was chaotic, it's actually not bad. The health systems hold up. They stand up very well.
So this idea of the second administrative centre operating as a sort of tensioning point to the original administrative centre or urban centre of the indigenous community, I know that the French Imperial Project had some, or I'm under the impression that the French Imperial Project had a certain kind of specifically peculiar agenda of creating a second class of people who are mixed race. I did my master's thesis project in Senegal, in Dakar in Senegal, and did research around that, and that was quite. But I don't know. But am I right in assuming that what the British idea, so that you see in, say, for example, Nigeria, is that they create a spatial, visual counterpoint which serves to produce the same effect? That is to say, produce a class of people who can encounter it and engage with it, and those that can't.
Yes, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, one thing I think, again, there's slight cultural amnesia about is the whole idea about the whole apartheid settlement. It does actually come from segregation, which, again, goes back to Ireland, beyond the pale.
Can you repeat that? So the what? The what settlement?
The apartheid, the segregated settlement. Oh, yeah. So this idea about various places where different people live actually comes to a large extent from the British encounter So before the Dutch actually, if you like, specialize it and turn it into the horrors that were apartheid, I think the British encounter was very much around, yes, creating separate spaces for different groups. So in fact, what we have actually both in India and I hear in a lot of Africa and the rest of the post-colonies are first class, second class, and third class cities. So that's to do with the ways in which administration takes place. But in these cities, you would still have these spaces for different groups. So there's often the government reserved area, which is essentially white, but as you have more educated, quote unquote, natives, they can also encounter that space. Then you have the native town, where the natives are. And then there's the unregulated, I guess what we've now called the slum areas around it. So the rules of engagement, so to speak, the spatial design is very much around making sure that the areas where the colonial administration lived, worked, and played was properly laid out, had the roads, had the the houses, the bungalow houses, and whatever it is, half a hectare of land. That all happened in that part. Whereas by the time you get to the native city, the what would I call it? The land rights are less. You've got less land, but there's still a specific way in which you have to build your house. So this is back to the ideas about making sure the sanitation and everything works. And then you had everything else. Now it becomes interestingly different depending on where it is. So in parts of northern Nigeria, because you've already got an Islamic state, Islamic setup, there's what's called the walled city, and often those who are true indigents live within the walls. And apparently that there was always that negotiation as to where the colonial administrator would live in relation to the city. And this is where you find actually sometimes even the schools, that's in my book, they actually begin to be built they're built much more like traditional Hausa buildings with the thick mud walls and everything. So there's an appreciation of a culture that has a kind of segregational level, because if you were an outsider in Islamic cities, you lived outside the walls. And if you're an insider, you live inside the walls. So you've got these spatial segregated spaces already that exist. And I would say the British way of making sure that continued was to lay out the cities that way. The other reading, particularly about West Africa, is The Triumph of the Mosquito. There was never the issue about there being too many Europeans in a lot of West Africa because they died.
Yeah.
So there was the need to have a much more, at least a native elite who would be part of this larger, what I call it, colonial administration area. But the majority of the natives would be in in fact, they call it the native town. Or the native area, which is part of the component of the town.
I see. So that sort of foregrounds the apartheid approach to segregation. I think that's really
well. And then you also have you normally have either the golf course, the polo ground. There's always that cordon sanitaire, which the French adopt. So there's that space between them, but and then the justification is interesting, because before the understanding about the Anopheles mosquitoes relationship to malaria, the idea was that the miasma, you need to be away from the natives who carry these diseases.
Yeah. Miasma theory. It's really peculiar. Yeah. I've been reading about miasma theory really recently. We have a little bit got back to miasma theory these days.
Well, this is it. Some of us laugh because some of the regulations probably of Victorian times have probably saved some of the cities, certainly in West Africa. You couldn't design a bathroom in West Africa without having a window. You needed to have that ventilation through. Yeah. So the idea about, totally sealed, like a shopping center and so on in most of Africa is totally foreign, right up until we come to the 90s when we're having we want to be like Dubai or whatever it is. But generally, the basic design always suggested you needed to have ventilation. Basically, the things we're being told now.
Yes. The wheel has turned. So we have this moment of colonialism. We could talk about that for ages, and it's an incredibly difficult topic, but a very interesting and exciting, I suppose, in a way. And we then have this moment of post-colonialism, where we get also some of the characters that have played a role in establishing, people like Le Corbusier with his proposals for Addis Ababa in the 1930s, which is a kind of erasure program, and Corbusier's legacy is rightly being a little bit questioned these days. And people like Fry and Drew, who go, and you've written about them, who go into West African contexts and produce something that is synthetic, hybrid. I mean, I'd love to. So this relates to this idea of post-colonialism, and I wondered whether you could perhaps talk about that, and perhaps how some of these modernists straddled this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm quite sympathetic in the sense that I think there was that moment, again, post-World War II, when in India and in Africa, people, I guess, emerging elite are saying, we want to be free. There's a narrative around being different and independent.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, looking back, there are the colonial structures, of which architecture is one of the major things. So I have talked about the idea about, either you have the church or you have the clock tower in a lot of schools. So there's always this organizing structure, which is effectively a throwback to the idea about, either the church saved you, or indeed colonial government is at its best with its clock tower telling us what the time is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that idea about, these buildings of the colonial administration are things that remind us of a past that we want to move on from, is incredibly seductive. But I think, again, ingrained in almost 100 years or more of people's memories is the fact that there's still the primitive. So I think I have quoted it, and I really still have to go back to the archive, but there's an encounter apparently between James Cubitt, the architect, and Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was the first premier of Nigeria, the Eastern region. And he sets up the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, which is a bit like Ibadan, but in Eastern Nigeria. And he suggests, we can have some really interesting mud brick buildings because it'll be much more environmentally responsive and everything. And Azikiwe says to him, we're not going back to the primitive ages. Our buildings have to be in concrete. So there's that idea about the past still being something to break away from. And even if the colonial is bad, there needs to be something that is not primitive, quote unquote, and is different from the colonial. So in some ways, that modernist moment that a lot of Africans, I would say India as well, encounters post-World War II is something that a lot of the elites want to embrace, because we want to be like everybody else. You could say that fast forward to the 90s, the MTV generation, everybody wants to be able to live the MTV life. So you've got that happening, I would say, in the 1940s, plus the fact that there's a bit of the techno-science that I just alluded to, where, these buildings are justified because they do the things, what you see is what you get. There's good ventilation, the brise soleil works, and so on and so forth. Although nowadays we know that some of that may well have come from the mashbriya in Islamic culture, the idea about the screen, and so on and so forth. But there's a justification for what is considered modern. And that's the lifestyle, and that's the architecture that the elite in these new nations aspire towards. And you've got the architects like Fry and Drew, who really transmogrify from being part of the colonial regime to being the architects who sort of say, and we can give it to you. So, it's seductive, isn't it? So I'm sympathetic, because I guess also because I went to University of Nigeria, Nsukka, for example, and my school was probably my secondary school was a UNESCO. It actually comes from the UNESCO School Designs Program in the 1960s, and it was a comfortable school to be in. So some of it, in terms of the way the buildings performed, worked. The question would be, indeed, as you say, what was the identity? What therefore becomes the modern? The more skillful architects, like I would say Cubitt, Fry and Drew, the ACP group, then synthesize, they appropriate bits of the African into it, whether it's, using block work that follows the, what are they called again? The Adinkra symbols in Ghana. So Prempeh College, for example, you've got this screen wall that the little blocks actually relate back to Ghanaian models and ideas, or African co-partnerships, Bristol Hotel in Lagos, where they get, well, interestingly, Susan Wenger is a Swiss Jewish emigre, who then becomes an Orisha priest in Western Nigeria, but she creates these amazing murals. So there's a whole mural that she is commissioned to put on the side of this hotel. So you've got this real syncretism in a way, but you could say it's still mediated from a Western perspective, So there are these interesting experiments that happen, but they don't really, I think the issue is at that moment, what would have been great is if that then becomes absorbed, appropriated, and changed by a local African elite, but they stand as being almost kind of experimental pieces.
Yeah.
And I guess the person in the quote unquote slum doesn't really engage that much with it. So now we've got these fetishized objects. Yeah. Almost.
But then you have this other thing which you've alluded to in both these books that I read of yours, which is the experience of the diaspora itself feeding back into it. And you see that perhaps really clearly in the work of someone like, well, you see it most clearly in your previous reference, which is MTV Cribs, which is the idea that so whilst the slum dwelling, informal settlement dwelling African might not encounter modernist architecture and its joys and glories, they do encounter the world of media, and they do see what the African experience in America, in the UK, wherever it is, in South Korea. I lived in South Korea a while, and there's a large Nigerian community in the center of Seoul there. So there's this diasporic experience which feeds back, probably, my guess, is at a more grassroots level than...
I think it's beginning to trickle back, yeah. Which is interesting. I think we're at a very interesting point in time. I mean, obviously the big ones that we've all heard of are Kere's work in Burkina Faso, and obviously, what's his name again? The floating school. Yeah. His name eludes me at this point. But anyway, his work, and to a lesser extent, David Ajayi. So there are big players, but again, they're on the international stage. But as you say, at the kind of local, informal settlement level, yes, everybody has a cheap mobile phone now. It might not be an Apple, but they have a cheap mobile phone. And that gives them that link to a reality. And in Nigeria, the idea about Nollywood, very close to Bollywood, you can live your dream looking at your Nollywood clip. And I think that's slowly beginning to have, make incremental steps into how people see their lives and how they live. But again, I think it's the issue that the built environment is it's always slightly behind the curve. So the literature we've got already, there's some really, Chimamanda Adichie or whatever, there's always nowadays, in terms of new authors, there's always some authors from Africa, whether it's Adichie, whether it's, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who are the earlier generation. But I mean, I'd be thinking about people like, there's a Kenyan authoress and so on. Anyway, there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot in the area of textiles. Music I've commented on. You now have people who are chart hitting both in Africa and in America and in the UK. So there's that. But the translation of culture in terms of the built environment has been much slower. And I would say it's not just the fact that buildings last for longer. I think it's the issue about that failure to engage with the building materials, which is, I would say, only beginning to happen now. So Southeast Asia is where I normally go to, in the sense of the bamboo architecture that's coming through from places like Vietnam, Bali, and so on. But for a lot of Africa, there's a closer adherence to the building standards that we've had, to be honest, since the Victorian times. It's taken a long time to move from let's do something more experimental, or let's look at materials that are more local, So it's that interstice that we're beginning to discuss. But in some ways, yes, you'd say an informal settlement, particularly in places like South Africa. I think there's been more creative use. I mean, in the past, I have called it, what do you call it, slum chic, shack architecture. But I think there's been a bit more creativity. I'm beginning to see a bit of it now. Even in Lagos, there's a new blog whose name I do not have, but hopefully when you edit this, I'll look for it, where they've now started to look at a retrospective of buildings over the past year. So I've looked at their last 3 years. And recently there's been one about the rehabilitation of a Victorian-built house in a kind of near coastal community in Lagos, and how they've got the wooden materials together, they've redone them, but there's been an influence of some kind of African carving, which certainly when I was doing architecture in Nigeria was just not the thing.
Yeah.
So there's the beginning of an appreciation of, if you like, a historic past, which can sort of begin to influence how architecture is interpreted or reinterpreted. Yeah. And then there was also there's a container cafe, which wasn't just containers. It really did have some kind of, what I call it, there was a kind of nod towards, well, indeed, the kind of informality in the way in which it was all put together. Now, what I don't know is who these architects are. I suspect it's a much more multinational, or at least multinationally trained architecture set of architects, which is probably right, because as you say, the diaspora comes back. So it's that influence of probably the generation below me who are sort of saying, right, we've got our degrees from Europe or wherever, and we want to sort of see what we can do in an emerging diasporic Africa. I mean, the balance to that, though, is this Acon city, which I commented on, which is, kind of some kind of bad image of it's a combination of Dubai and Wakanda. So the fact that you could actually do that is frightening. What that actually means, particularly because it said, oh well, there'll be lots of employment. What, as maids and so on? Where does the local employment come into recreating a Dubai in one of the slightly poorest countries in Africa? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And we have the spectre in Lagos of Echo Island, which will be the largest island stroke gated community apparently in Africa.
Is it going to be like Macau, basically? Oh dear.
I mean, basically it's an island. Yeah.
There you go. But it's this thing, this modernization process. I don't know if you've got a phrase for it, this vernacularization of modernity, which has its parallels so Fry and Drew try it out and they're relatively successful, and it foreshadows or foregrounds the critical regionalism moment potentially in Western and European architecture. And then you get it coming back. And what I wonder with people like Fry and Drew is whether there's an attempt to kind of stick on Africanness as a kind of wallpaper. And you see this in David Adjaye. And you look at the Smithsonian Museum he did recently, which has a very kind of, it's a big shed with some cultural references to it. But I do wonder whether there is in these works that you're talking about a sense of embodying not pre-colonial, but African centric social processes and modes of dwelling and living, so that it's not just a replication of the unité de habitation.
Well, that's why I'd say I'd look at I've got a lot of time for Kere. I think he really does look at context in a very interesting way, and he is somebody who, again, if we look at class and architecture, I think really is the one to look at. His father lived in a village, said, you, my son, I want you to go out, get your education and come and help us develop. And he comes back and his first thing is that school and I think that's really interesting because, I mean, my argument with the kind of, as I call them, the aid fraternity is we're still raising money for schools in Burkina Faso, whereas one of the best school architects is a Burkina Faso. So why are we still, you think that you work with said person. But the point is, his background is much more, I think, if you like, in the soil, for lack of a better word, than a lot of diaspora architects who are already, they're coming in with some middle class values. And the way in which he actually articulates his space is very, very interesting, I would say. And you can see that continuing in most of the things he does.
Yeah.
And even if he's doing a frivolous thing, so to speak, like whatever it was, a Coachella or whatever it was, you can see that. I would say there's something there that tells me that it's innate. Whereas I have to say I struggle with some of the others. I mean, I do like the floating school, but I do think it's a provocation, and I do like his use of materials. But in terms of there being something to do with an identity, I'm still looking for that in a lot of what's coming out of emerging architecture. Whereas when you listen to music, you look at textiles and the other creative arts, it's very clearly there. And, you know, I don't know, I mean, some people have pointed out again that Demis Woko, who you may have heard of, I mean, he basically checked himself out of ABU's area. He decided he wasn't going to go through architectural training. And some would argue that his work, again, is much more infused in the artistry and creativity of West Africa than the classically trained architects. So you might take it the other way and say maybe we're being modeled by effectively a Western architectural education and training.
A Western architectural education and training which has its roots in a very hierarchical idea of what constitutes acceptable architectural precedent and knowledge, which is a problem that isn't limited, in my opinion, to the African experience, but is a problem generally speaking, and why architecture remains in this country, as in the UK, an elite practice, because it still doesn't permit these things. Demis Nwoko, you put one of my students in, you informed her about him. And so it was my first encounter with him, and I thought it was extraordinary because he was using concrete. If Francis Queré's work has that beautiful timber light, but with rammed earth walls here and there. Demis Nwoko's it's got volume, it's got monolithic qualities, it's got some of these really modernist architectural qualities, but at the same time, spatially and organizationally.
So, I mean, he's working with the materials he has, and this is somebody who's in his late 80s now. So he is very much, I mean, he'd have been a young person around the time Fry and Drew were around. But, you wonder whether his actually delinking from what would have been standard architectural practice doesn't have something to do with his encounter, which is very different. But he was and has always been the odd one out. The Nigerian Institute of Architects, which is the equivalent of the RIBA, really don't encounter with him because he's not an architect. Hello. So we've got this thing, which again, let's face it, assemble and so on. I think there's some architects who still turn their nose up at some of that stuff. So if you like, the train is coming, but it's coming slowly.
I don't want to take in too much more of your time, but I do want to ask one thing, and I didn't raise it in my questions beforehand, but you raised it in the introduction, which is this idea of appropriation and authenticity. Well, appropriation specifically, which is I don't know if you've written about it, and I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but my students I had one student wrote his master's dissertation called Cultural Appropriation is Okay. He's of Nigerian origin, London boy from Nigerian origin, very, 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 very good dissertation. And he was looking at the idea of Gothic architecture being appropriative of certain Islamic forms and structural logics. This idea, again, to go back to something you earlier said, which is about flows and trade. So if Islamic architecture influences Western architecture, likelihood is there's influences the other way. But pre-modern society is described as being insular, small, backward, so on and so forth. So we can't possibly accept that there might have been knowledge flows. And so I wonder about this idea of cultural appropriation being less problematic than perhaps we might think, insofar as what it represents is a sharing of the best ideas that we have.
Yeah, I think when it's done well, why not? I think the problem we have with architecture is, in a way, yeah, I guess it's the way we view architecture. What is wholesome and what is harmonious versus what's pastiche and what's added. Because, again, let's go back to things like textiles, music. Somehow they've been able to absorb these different influences. But what is it about architecture? Is it because there's so much fixity in the way in which we deal with it? Or is it the fact that lifestyles have changed so much that you can either be one or the other? I think that ability to be fluid and create something that does what will be considered interesting, even though it's got various appropriated things in it. So, well, that would be the Pomo movement, for example, which, let's face it, didn't get the best of receptions even in the West. So if we talk about, I don't know, postmodern movement in Africa, I think there's something about how that really reads. And yeah, because I have environmental design training as well, my point is, are we comfortable in these spaces? To me, that would be my first call. So if you want to have columns, in Nigeria, one of the apparently signifiers of wealth at the moment is to have these Corinthian columns at the front of your house, or if it's a bank. So you've got these literally polystyrene type columns, and then the bank behind it with the glass, the kind of Miami glass facade. My issue would be less with the columns, but more with the fact that how much is it costing to air condition behind that Miami glass facade?
Yeah.
But there again, yeah, in a way it creates its own character. Why not? We don't all have to live in what will probably be Caribbean style beach houses in a lot of the tropics, which would be much more culturally appropriate, for example.
Yeah.
So I think it's more the case of, I guess, how one justifies what one does compositionally and otherwise. Because, let's go to avant-garde art, the edges of jazz and so on. Who's ever said that Miles Davis didn't appropriate when he wanted to, and so on. But there's something about how I think it indeed the flows. So if the diaspora comes back and begins to work with, I guess, the everyday, and less with the seriously rich who can afford anything, what might that produce? I think that will be the test of the pudding. Because at the moment, the issue is that it's still high art to a large extent, architecture. And there's that, well, I've talked about it too. I think there's almost that, I go back to the Turner moment when you got kind of design and site and services versus architecture. So the architects go one way, and then we do site and services for everybody who can't really afford the architecture. What we really want is a reuniting of that schism, where we begin to look at what or how we can actually, again, reinvent or use the appropriations needed to really infuse informal settlement, so they're not just these basic site and services sites, and they actually begin to function in a way in which people are much more involved in them. I guess, again, maybe this is where we look at South Africa, where the planned horrid nature of the townships have pretty much gone away, and you're getting bits of whatever you want to call it, urban formation in some of the townships, which is different again. So it's not replicating, for example, the posh bits of Rondebosch in Cape Town. There are bits of Khayelitsha that you begin to see bits of planning. I think the issue there is that who's doing the planning? So you've got the benign Western architects, or architects from, indeed, the benign townships who are doing their do-good stuff, and how much is actually being done in collaboration with the locals. So this is the co-production and co-creation of which we hear so much. How much actually takes place, and what might that really be? Because what you really want are those for whom the space is being planned, calling most of the shots. But that's difficult when the money's coming from elsewhere.
It is, yes. And it's also very difficult when the voice of those people, when the people themselves are used to their voice not being heard. They don't even have the languages to articulate what. So the architect in that situation has a very complex role, almost like an almost like an anthropologist, like an ethnographer, of exploring and examining and watching and observing and talking. But it's complicated, isn't it?
I think it will change because I think with the larger numbers of diasporas and young diasporas actually thinking about investing in Africa, because I think that is, as they say, this is the last place of investment apparently. Africa and bits of Southeast Asia that aren't heavily invested. It'll be interesting to see what that encounter produces.
What a fabulous finishing point. Thank you so very much, Ola. That's been amazingly interesting. Thank you.
Right. Well, happy editing. I hope you can edit out all the
I'm not even going to edit out this bit.
No, it's good. It's good. Yeah.
Really
You had to make me think a bit, which is always good.
Well, I think that was rather wonderful. Thanks to Ola for being so generous with her time and ideas. Thanks to her publishers too for letting me look at the books. Please look in the podcast description for links to these and Ola's academic profile. And of course, please like, subscribe, follow and share Ears for Architecture with lots and lots of people. Cheers.